So, first of all, let me take you through what's going to happen here this afternoon. The paper in front of you has 4 sections, a practice section, and then 3 other sections. We're going to spend 20 minutes going through the practice section and the first section, and then we'll look at the answers there, and then I'm going to give you 20 minutes of time to complete the second section by yourselves. We'll look at the answers, and then you will take the papers home, and you will check the answers against the answer booklet that will be published on the school website. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to revise for the forthcoming examination. We've done a walking, talking mock before. We've done 2 of these, and the last ones we did were for Year 11 in the lead up to their English language examinations. And I think they were unanimous when they fed back to us that they found them incredibly useful. They went into the examinations very confident, and certainly at the end of the examinations, when I came down to meet the students afterwards, they were much more confident than I'd ever seen students leave an exam hall in my career, and I've been here now 9 years. So you're in an incredibly fortunate position here. So what I'd like you to do is make sure that you are listening very carefully to everything that I say. When I give you instructions, do follow them. I'd like you to follow me as I'm reading. So when I turn in the page, I'd like you to follow the text on the paper in front of you as I read. As I read the questions, follow me. As I point to words, phrases, follow me. Okay? That's very important. If anybody does not have a highlighter, could you put your hand up now? We can supply you with a highlighter pen. It's really important with a test of this nature that when you're dealing with texts, you're able to highlight words, phrases, sentences, so that you're able to highlight for yourselves and pinpoint words, phrases, sentences of importance to you in answering the question. Some admin first. You're going to begin, and you're going to follow me. Remember, let's do this as if you were sitting the test. You're going to begin with your first name. I'm using a pen. You should use a pencil, an HB pencil. The reason for that is because that means as you go through the paper, of course, you can actually rub out any errors that you might make. So it's very clear for the people who are going to be marking the tests afterwards that your answer is the one that you've provided, not the one that, of course, you erroneously made in the first instance. Surname, which is your last name. Don't get ahead of yourselves. Sometimes people write their full name in the first line. And of course, the school. It's important to get these details right, and more they'll become significant as you go through the school. Certainly when you get to GCSE and you're doing this and you're actually writing your details on the fronts of papers, that is the only way the exam board are able to recognize you, by your candidate number, by your name, by the centre or the school that you write on the front. So these details are very important. Your class is your form. Date of birth. And then the date, today's date is the 13th. You don't need to touch the total score section, of course. Okay, obviously there will be teachers available on the day who will be standing at the front giving you instructions, so do wait for their instructions before you start turning through the paper. So you will have my consent now to turn inside. You're all familiar with the layout of the paper. The first section, as I've said before, is the practice section, so obviously you won't have any marks for this section. But nonetheless, it's a really important opportunity that you must take to get familiar with the kind of questions that you're going to be answering, with the text types that you're going to be reading and looking at and selecting information from. So let's read the topmost information. It tells us in this booklet there are different types of question for you to answer in different ways. Here are some practice questions which show you the types of question you will see in the test. The instructions tell you what you need to do. start by reading the text in the box below. It's very easy, in the first instance, to begin by ignoring the text and think, well, actually, I would rather move on to begin looking at the question so I know what I'm looking for. No, don't do that. That's wrong. Begin by reading the text so you have a clear idea, a clear understanding and awareness of what the text is about. That's really going to help you develop an understanding of the text and the kind of questions that follow. So let's read it together. There are some Welsh words in this. I'm not sure I'm necessarily going to be able to pronounce them correctly. Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks for the final day of their castle exploration trip. Today, they would visit Castell y Bear. Bryn had marked on the map which castle they had investigated each day, and Sarah had been photographing and recording the plants that lived there. Dolbardarn Castle, on the first day, had been their favourite, but the views of Deganwy on the third day had been amazing. Bryn slotted the neatly folded maps between the compass and the first aid kit in his bag, while Sarah crammed her stripy hat between the camera and half-eaten packet of soggy biscuits. Okay, now we can move on to look at the questions. So, question A. What did Sarah have in her bag? Tick 3. This is important. You have to tick and select 3 of the options. Be sure that you select 3 and be sure to check that you have selected 3. So, of course, what we have to do is familiarize ourselves with the options in front of us. These are maps, hat, first aid kit, compass, biscuits, and camera. And we have to identify which of these items appear in Sarah's bag. So highlight with me Sarah and in her bag. Because, of course, there are 2 characters here. There's not just Sarah on this castle's exploration trip, but rather Sarah and Bryn. There are 2 characters, and you would imagine that they might have different items between them that they would store in their own bags. So we have to identify which is which. So, let's have a look. What did Sarah have in her bag? Well, it tells us in the second paragraph here. Bryn slotted the neatly folded maps between the compass and the first aid kit in his bag, while Sarah crammed her stripy hat between the camera and half-eaten packet of soggy biscuits. So, we can see that Sarah has a hat, she has a camera, and she has a half-eaten packet of soggy biscuits, which is best represented by the word biscuits. Perfect. Those are my 3 ticks. And of course, we can check their accuracy against Bryn. Bryn, it says, slotted the neatly folded maps between the compass, so he has a map, he has a compass, and the first aid kit. There you are. So we can see that Bryn's carrying very different items to Sarah. We know what Sarah's carrying in her bag. So we can now move on to question B. Look at the look at the text in the box below. Underline 1 word that tells you that they were excited about their trip. Now, this is not asking us to look at the box above. It's looking at the box below where there is a small limited amount of text. It asks us to underline 1 word. Actually, you'll notice here that it says underline 1 in bold. I think perhaps the most important words are 1 word. So it is important, you see, for you to read the instructions carefully. So, Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks for the final day of their castle exploration trip. Today, they would visit Castell y Bear. So, 1 word that tells you that they were excited. Okay, so Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks for the final day of their castle exploration trip. Today they would visit Castell y Bear. The only word there that I think remotely represents excitement is the word eagerly. I know that the word eagerly suggests excitement. If I do something eagerly, I'm excited to do it. So definitely the word I would be underlining would be eagerly. C. Find and copy 2 things that Bryn had in his bag. Oh, excellent. We've already done a lot of the groundwork on this, haven't we? So, let's go to that. Back to the second paragraph. At the top there, Bryn slotted the neatly folded maps between the compass and the first aid kit. So, we can select 2 of those 3 items. We could select the folded maps, the compass, or the first aid kit. So I'm going to go for the compass and the first aid kit. Do make sure that you're writing as I write. Write what I write in this section, please. Do follow me and make sure you're using your highlighter as well. Okay, we're going to turn over. Put ticks to show which statements are true and which are false. Okay, so let's familiarise ourselves first with those 3 statements. Bryn had marked castles on the map. The trip had been educational but not enjoyable. Well, first of all, I'm raising my eyebrow at that because we've just had to answer a question about how eager and excited the 2 children are to actually complete their castle's trip. So I'm beginning to think maybe that's a false statement. They're trying to throw us off the scent a little bit here, you know. And finally, Sarah carried the first aid kit in her rucksack. This should be easy. So, Bryn had marked the castles on the map. Does he? Let's go back to the text. Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks for the final day of their castle exploration trip. Today, they would visit Castle Bear. Bryn had marked on the map which castle they had investigated each day. Absolutely, that is then true. Bryn had marked castles on the map. Yes. The trip had been educational but not enjoyable. Well, as we've already said, there are words in here that suggest the opposite. The word eagerly, which we looked at earlier, certainly suggests the opposite. And also that word there, amazing, and the exclamation mark suggests that actually they've had a lovely time. So I think I'm going to suggest that one is false. But actually you see how difficult that is, because the rest of the statement, up until the point where it says was not enjoyable, is true. It's just the last bit of that sentence that is false. The trip had been educational but not enjoyable is false. Sarah carried the first aid kit in her rucksack. Did she now? Let's have a look. Bryn slotted the neatly folded maps between the compass and the first aid kit. The first aid kit is in Bryn's bag, in which case that too is false. Okay, next. Put these in order to show what Bryn and Sarah did on their trip by numbering them from 1 to 4. Admired the views at Deganwy, went home, visited Dolbardan Castle, and explored Castell y Bear. Well, I don't remember from my reading of that extract anything that suggested they went home. So that's going to come pretty down on my far down on my list, I think. So let's go back to it. So let's turn to that text. Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks for the final day of their castle exploration trip. Today, they would visit Castell y Bear. So that's today. And Bryn had marked on the map which castle they had investigated each day, and Sarah had been photographing and recording the plants that lived there. Dolbardan Castle on the first day, so the first day of their exploration, they had visited Dolbardan Castle. That would be number 1. That is the first thing that they did, and remember, we're having to place these things in order of occurrence, the order in which they occurred. So 1 next to Dolbardan Castle. It says next, on the first day had been their favourite, but the views at Deganwy on the third day had been amazing. So next, they had admired the views at Deganwy. Remember, let's go back to this here. we understand from the very beginning of the extract that they are exploring Castell y Bear today, so that would come after the other two. So, and then went home doesn't appear within the text, so we must assume that is number 4, and that's the last thing that happened. So admired the views at Deganwy 2. Today they're exploring Castell y Bear 3, and went home, well, they must do that last 4. Okay. Now then, next. From our understanding of our reading, we should be able to do the next bit fairly easily. So, choose the best word to fit the passage and tick your choices. Now, before I'm going to even attempt to do any such thing, I'm going to read it, because I have to sort of contextualize it and get my bearings, get an understanding of it. So, it says, Bryn and Sarah were visiting. Well, immediately I'm thinking castles, because I've read the word castle several times within that extract. But let's check that it's there. It is there. I'm not going to answer it yet. And recording which people, animals, plants, fungi, I can't quite remember that bit. I'm going to have to come back to that. Lived there. That should be fairly straightforward there. Okay. Text. Bryn and Sarah eagerly packed their rucksacks. We can see that today they're visiting Castell y Bear. We know Castell sort of means castle, doesn't it? But also later on it says the word castle there. Dolbarden Castle, the word castle occurs many times. So let's first of all start with A and say castles. And recording which people, animals, plants, fungi. I don't remember them seeing any people. Animals, certainly, no. And the word fungi doesn't appear either. Let's have a look. It says here that Sarah had been photographing and recording, there you go, the plants that lived there. And that's the last answer for this section. It tells us to stop. Please wait until you are told to start work on page 4. So once you've completed your practice section, remember, some of you may be, approaching this in a far more careful, laborious manner to other people. Some may finish ahead of you. That's not a problem. Don't worry about the people around you. In fact, don't think about the people around you at all. Don't look beyond your desk and the texts there in front of you. So, in this booklet, you have 3 texts to read and answer questions about. Read the first text carefully before you start answering the questions for that text. Then carefully read the next text before answering the questions and so on. You should work through the booklet referring to the text when you need to until you finish page 15 or until you are asked to stop. You have up to 60 minutes to do the rest. I'm told, on average, students take around about 40 minutes to answer this question, and to that, I usually respond with, what? I think that everybody should be aiming to finish at the end of the hour, because at no point will I be putting my pen down here. Just like in the GCSE examinations, I would want to be working right up until the last minute, making sure that everything I have written, every answer I have ticked or written, is absolutely accurate, and I'm happy with it. So, let's move on. You can see the next section there is a piece of rather substantial text. Welcome to medieval times. If you are ever asked whether you would rather live in a past century, you would be wise to consider the problem of ill health before answering. How much better to live at a time in which, when you fall sick, you go to a doctor or a surgeon and get well again. It has to be said, the prime reason to avoid medieval times is sickness. In almost every respect, 14th century life is unhealthy compared to our own. True, there are no exhaust fumes in the streets to pollute our lungs, and no tobacco smoke for that matter either. But there are open fires in many houses, and the exposure to smoke for so much of the year causes lung diseases of a similar nature. There may be no fish-killing chemicals accidentally released by pharmaceutical companies into the rivers, but there are all sorts of other things which get into the water supply, from overflowing cesspits to dead animals. That word pharmaceutical actually threw me then for a moment. Is it a problem if I don't understand it? Well, it might be an issue later on if I'm asked a question about it, but in the meantime, I'm not going to worry about it if I don't really understand it or can't read it. Children do not suffer from allergic reactions caused by dust in wall-to-wall carpeting or the excessive use of cleaning fluids, but you can hardly say that that is a good thing when nearly half of them do not live to adulthood. Why might you fall ill? There are, of course, many reasons. Not least is the likelihood that you will be struck by a blade, an arrow, a staff, or even a cannonball. The violence inherent in society, oops, what is that word there? Coupled with a near complete disregard for what we think of as health and safety means that serious injuries are very common. In addition, even where such injuries are not fatal, poor knowledge of medicine and hygiene means that blood poisoning often leads to death or the amputation of a limb. There is very little understanding of how diseases spread or how the body functions. Hospital staff often put seriously ill people in one bed together, even when they are suffering from infectious illnesses. Germ theory is unknown. The circulation of the blood is a complete mystery. If you are found in a comatose state in 1300, no one will check your pulse to see whether you are still alive. Instead, they will place a bowl of water on your chest to see if you are still breathing. Medieval life might be unhealthy, but some medieval medical concepts are unhealthier still. Very informative article there, isn't it? And I'm sure we'd be taking some of that knowledge that we've gleaned from our reading to the next section where we're asked perhaps what we might consider some rather more complex questions. And that's something we should expect. We should expect the questions within each section to get progressively more difficult. So do be aware of that. Also, back to those words, inherent, for instance. What do we do when we come to them? Well, there have been countless opportunities when you've been in school, when you've been in classrooms, in English, in modern foreign languages, in Welsh, where you've come across words where there are clear cognates that you can work out the meaning of the word. Or you could use the context in which that word appears to try to identify the meaning of the word. There are lots of things that you can do to apply to this text in order to work out some of those words. And believe me, they will expect you to understand them. So continue to follow me, continue to use your pens, your highlighters now as I do. So, question 1. In what opinion is suggested by the writer in the first paragraph? Tick 1. So, a couple of things there. Tick 1 for a start. We have to select one answer only. And also, it does tell us that we need to be concerned only with the first paragraph. I think all of us should be able to recognize by now that this is the first paragraph. So let's highlight that as well. Let's make sure we know what we're talking about. Medieval people were less intelligent than people today. Well, I think that's probably inaccurate. I'm sure they were just as intelligent, maybe just not as informed. And also, does the article in any way refer to intellect or the intelligence of the medieval people? Well, I can't remember that being said or stated. Only healthy people would want to live in the 14th century. Well, even healthy people surely can contract serious illnesses, so I'm not sure that is necessarily true. Healthcare was poorer in the past centuries. I think that's probably fair. And people were more concerned about their health in medieval times. Well, not likely. Certainly when the article is telling us that they're putting sick people into bed with healthy people, that doesn't seem like a very good idea, does it? So, I would suggest from the offset that the answer there is 3. Of course, we need to check that before we actually tick that box. We need to read back through, and we need to use inference there, because it might not actually be stated. It might not be stated as fact within that first paragraph. It might be implied or inferred. So let's have a look. If you are ever asked whether you would rather live in a past century you would be wise to consider the problem of ill health before answering. How much better to live at a time in which, when you fall sick, you go to a doctor or a surgeon and get well again. It has to be said, the prime reason to avoid medieval times is sickness. At no point did it say anything about intelligence. No. Only healthy people would want to live in the 14th century. Well, that is not implied or suggested at all. People were more concerned about their health in medieval times. Again, not suggested by the text at all. Nothing in there points to that answer. So I can only conclude that the correct answer must be that healthcare was poorer in past centuries, in past times. And we know that's certainly true from what it tells us within the text. Right, let's go on. Question 2. What does the word prime mean or indicate in the first paragraph? Right, okay, first of all, when you come across a question like this, it's really important that you identify the word within the text. So, where does the word prime sit? It sits here in the last line. It has to be said, the prime reason to avoid medieval times is sickness. Prime reason. Right. I'm going to use past knowledge, past experience of that word prime to first of all try to decide what that might mean for myself. I'm thinking prime, the prime reason, the most important reason. So I need to use that understanding of that word to infer what might be suggested by the text. So let's have a look at the options. The sickness in medieval times was natural. The sickness in medieval times was natural. The word natural isn't used, and it does suggest that sickness it occurs more regularly perhaps than it does in modern times. So that's a possibility, perhaps, in my mind. Medieval people were better at avoiding disease. No, it doesn't say that. In fact, it suggests the opposite within the article, doesn't it? People were just starting to learn about sickness in medieval times. Well, again, the article doesn't say that. The article doesn't suggest anything about medieval people learning about sickness. There was more than one disadvantage to living in medieval times. So the prime reason, back to the text, to avoid medieval times is sickness. The most important reason to avoid medieval times. So it's suggesting then there was more than one disadvantage to living in medieval times. So the prime disadvantage is sickness. The most important reason is sickness, but it does suggest, doesn't it, that there may be other reasons why you might not want to live in medieval times. I think that's the one. The prime suggests the most important, and therefore the most important reason is sickness, but there are other reasons. There you go. Okay. Complete the table below to show whether the following health issues mentioned in the text relate to medieval times or modern times. Okay, so tobacco smoke. Let's look through the text together. It doesn't actually state at this point, does it, that we should be using the first paragraph. So instead, we need to look at the entire text. And that's a large amount of text. So now we need to use another skill. We need to locate information quickly. So it asks us to identify whether tobacco smoke is a modern or medieval issue. Let's look for the word tobacco. Scanning through the text, and there you go. Tobacco. So let's highlight that. And it tells us, true, in medieval times, there are no exhaust fumes in the streets to pollute your lungs, and no tobacco. So, if there's no tobacco in medieval times, then we have to assume that is not a medieval issue, but rather a modern issue, an issue that plagues modern people. Yes. It does also tell us, and I'm going to emphasize this as well, that it does tell us in the question that we need to select either medieval or modern. We can't tick both. It has to be one or the other unless otherwise stated. So if you turn to the next page, for instance, you'll notice at the bottom of page 7 you have medieval, modern, both. So it's clearly not an option to select both boxes at this point. Okay, overflowing cesspits. So let's look for that word cesspit. Where would that be? Here you go. From overflowing cesspits. So let's read around that. Let's contextualize that. There may be no fish-killing chemicals accidentally released by pharmaceutical companies into the rivers in medieval times, but there are all sorts of other things which get into the water supply, from overflowing cesspits to dead animals. So we can see that in medieval times people were affected by overflowing cesspits. So let's go back, and yes, that is a medieval problem. Dust allergies. I kind of remember it talking about dust allergies in relation to carpets. So let's have a look here. Let's move down the page. Children do not suffer from allergic reactions caused by dust in wall-to-wall carpeting or the excessive use of cleaning fluids. Okay, so obviously dust allergies then is a modern issue. Open fires. Let's have a look. Let's have a look for the word fire. True, there are no exhaust fumes, no tobacco smoke. Okay. Oh, but there are open fires in many houses and the exposure to smoke. So there you are. That's obviously a medieval issue. Open fires. And exhaust fumes, well, I think we can all safely infer that that is clearly a modern issue. Okay, let's move on. Now then, you'll see in this section, and we're going to have to try to pick up the pace here a little bit, that you have phrases in italics. These phrases come from the text, yeah? And for that reason, again, the method I would be using is by locating that phrase within the text so we can contextualize it, and then we can move on, answer them with that in mind, okay? So, for instance, what is the purpose of this question? Now, a different question is asking us to identify the purpose of a question. And it's asking us to challenge the reader's understanding, to introduce the content that follows, to ask the writer's opinion, or to provoke an emotional reaction. Well, the question you'll find is here. Why might you fall ill? There are, of course, many reasons. Why is the author using it? The author's using it to introduce information about illness. And so for that reason, of course, the answer is to introduce the content that follows. Again, important words here. Find and copy one other word. This is not asking us for a 2-word phrase or a 3-word phrase. This is asking us for one word. And for that reason, obviously, we need to select only one. Let's have a look at this one together. Find and copy one other word that tells the reader that violence was a normal part of life in the 14th century. So let's have a look for that phrase. First of all, serious injuries are very common. Okay, so there's the phrase, the serious injuries are very common. So let's have a look around that. Let's have a look at the question. It tells the reader that violence was a normal part of life in the 14th century. We're part of that actual same paragraph. The violence inherent in society coupled with a near complete disregard for what we think of as health and safety means that serious injuries are very common. Okay, so it says the violence, that's that important word, isn't it? The violence inherent in society, coupled with a near complete disregard for, coupled with a near disregard for what we think of as health and safety. Health and safety is different to violence, so we need to focus on that phrase, the violence inherent in society. I can only infer that the word that tells the reader that violence is a normal part of life, life of course is the same as society here, is in fact the word inherent. And though I may not understand what that means, I understand what it means here, 9. It means naturally occurring. It's natural in society. Inherent must be the word I need. Okay? So there are other questions there that are similar, and we've already looked at a true and false question, and we've already looked within the first section as well at something similar to this, where we're actually piecing together a phrase by selecting or ticking one option. So I don't feel that we need to cover those now, and that is in fact the end of that section. So I hope that was helpful. I hope we've looked at the key questions that you might be asked to look at. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like you to turn to the next section. Each section is always initiated with a text. In this instance, it looks like a poem about a shoe. So I'd like you to begin by reading that. Then you may go on to answer the questions. Remember to apply everything that we've learnt here today. If there's enough time, we will look at the answers together. But if not, then you can look at the answers when you go home and you do section 3 for homework. Against the answer booklet that will be published on the school website. Okay? Right, you can begin section 2.